Hey everyone, welcome back to Living Beyond Sunday, the podcast where we talk about the everyday Christian life. My name is Jonathan Sams. I'm back here with Pastor Mike and his lovely bride, Ashley. Thank you for joining us again.
Yes, thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you so much.
Third time's a charm.
Third time's a charm.
Great.
And the topic we want to talk about today is one that I think are on a lot of people's minds. But before I get into it, if you don't mind, if you're watching on YouTube or if you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, please follow our podcast, like it, share it with a friend, subscribe to our YouTube channel, Image ATL, or send us your questions at pastormike@imageatl.com. We love answering those questions. But like I said, the topic we want to get into today is one that I think is on a lot of people's minds. I know that y'all have talked to a lot of people with this on their minds. It's dating and marriage. And so I just want to start off real quickly with some biblical principles. Y'all have been married for over a decade. So when it comes to...
Which is crazy.
Yeah, that's awesome, by the way. But I'm sure over that decade, you've mentored a lot of couples that are either dating and or got married and or just married.
Yeah.
And so what are some biblical principles that kind of in your survey of what you give to people when they're coming to you saying, hey, we're dating, or hey, I'm looking to date this person? What are some biblical principles that you give people to approach that topic?
Yeah, I think a couple just off the jump is, where are they at spiritually, right? Are they a Christian? Number one. Like, that's just number one. And number two, if they are a Christian, make your intentions known. One of the things that is very frustrating, and this is a problem primarily in Christian circles, is ambiguity and lack of clarity when it comes to like what's happening. And it's one thing to court for a little while, and it was called talking back in the day when we were coming up. Like, I don't know what it's called now. It's like hanging out or chilling or whatever. But it's like I just feel like that's the one thing you get, like this courting. It's
you want to hang,
hanging out. It's one thing to hang out for a couple of times or a month or so to figure out if you want to pursue dating this individual, but make your intentions known. And in the meanwhile, don't lead them on to. Don't be like, hey, I'm not sure if I want to date them, but y'all are making out on the second date. You know what I'm saying? Like, make your intentions known with what you're doing. And I put that onus on the man, right? Like, it is his job to lead the charge on bringing clarity to the relationship and saying like, hey, listen, I've hung out with you for a while now. I really enjoy hanging out with you. I want to be committed to this relationship, and I want to talk about what dating would look like, us entering into a dating relationship would look like. And is that something that you're interested in, something I'm interested in? Be clear on those intentions, right? Like those are kind of two major things I would say, just kind of prelim as it relates to like dating and kind of walking into dating.
Yeah.
And if you know mine and Michael's story, you know that we learned all this firsthand.
Yeah, the hard way.
4 years of dating, yeah.
Maybe we'll do another podcast where you can share your story.
Which one? Mine or his?
Yeah,
right.
Both perspectives. Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll do a part 1, part 2. Like and follow if you want to see that. All the thing is with that, those are good principles. But when it comes to sitting out with couples, I think it's different when it comes to maybe couples that are currently dating, couples who are looking to date. So when it comes to couples who are currently dating that have made this decision, like, hey, we're in this. Yeah. What do you see most, or what's your kind of top level things that you see pop up that you're like, maybe you should consider this that you haven't?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mainly speak to the women, but I'm walking with several girls right now that are in a dating relationship where they are more serious. First of all, I'll go back to what Michael said, like, is the man making his intentions known? If not, what are you doing? You need to have we used to call it a DTR. Like, you need to have
define
it.
The relationship, by the way.
We know what that means.
Me and Michael had one. There's a whole story behind that DTR, but I was like, I'm tired of this. So all that to say, I feel like that's priority number one. And this is with the foundation that you're both Christians, by the way. Also, from a woman's perspective, this is, again, I'm speaking to women, but are they involved in the local church? I feel like that's a massive deal. No, they can't lead you quite yet because you're not married, but are they already showing signs of that they're going to lead you well in marriage?
That's good.
For example, like, are they involved in the local church?
You're talking about women's perspective of the man that they're dating.
Yeah, and this is both. I mean, men too. I mean, is she involved in the local church? Also, communication. I feel like we could talk about this all day, but I've sat down with a lot of girls, and they're, this is dating and marriage, but specifically with dating, they're scared to tell their boyfriend certain things, or like, how do I tell him this? How do I tell him that? And I'm like, well, if you can't communicate now, you're not going to be able to communicate in marriage. It's going to be even harder.
What are some of those questions that you're like, man, I see these maybe it's a few, but what are these questions that's like, hey, these people just should ask this in dating, but they're either too scared or they don't, that they should. What are those top questions that in your experience?
Oh, goodness.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, some of them have to do with sexual things, obviously. Sex before marriage and just what that looks like, obviously to not do that, like crossing those boundaries. There's a lot of miscommunication with the couple. There needs to be, like, if you're messing up in that before marriage and you're not having a conversation afterwards, that is a massive red flag.
Yeah,
that's really good.
That has actually been probably my most common thing. Okay. And, but again, all that to say, without any shame, obviously, but you do need to talk about that, because it's not just sex, but any sin, right? If you cannot talk about your sin before, especially sin that you're indulging with together, before you're married, what does that look like after you're married? You know?
And I would piggyback on that. And you said this earlier, and I don't want to miss it because it's really good. Like, does the man show signs of being able to lead you? Like, does he seem like he's able to do that? And then, what is the church dynamic? Like, where do y'all stand as far as the local church? Yeah. We've seen couples that like disagree on, theology and stuff like that's a big deal to kind of come to grips on that. And then I'll swing the other way. This has been one that we've encountered a lot, where people are operating as though they're married, but they're not.
Yeah,
that's good.
And that's another
What's the most common kind of indicator? Because we're trying to be practical in this podcast. What's a common indicator of, like, are you operating as if you're married or not?
So taking trips together, spend the night together, basically like together all the time. The man feeling like I'm responsible to, like, spiritually lead her. And let me just pause to say, like, if you're not married, then Ephesians 5 is not for you. Okay, so like and this is the problem. And we've had to say this, like, it is for married couples.
That's good.
And so, and same goes for women. Ephesians 5 is not for you if you're not married. Your brother and sister.
You don't have to submit to him, and he's not your
right. He's not your spiritual leader, and he's not supposed to bathe you with the word and all that. And it's like there's couples that are like deeply experiencing this time in the Word together and deeply looking for. And I'm like, guys, calm down. You're not married yet. And so people kind of swing into that, very quickly.
And there's the intimacy that comes after that.
Right.
I mean, that's the way God has designed it. So when you are getting deep spiritually with one another, let's just say, call it quiet times together, like, there is going to be an intimacy is far more than sex, but it can lead right. to, so you're totally right. So that, but especially what you said about Ephesians 5 and all those things, you can see signs that they will. Like, I know so many incidents, and I'll just share one real quick, that I actually shared with a girl not too long ago. But one of my first green flags for you when it came to, like, your leadership, was we lived in two separate towns, probably 2.5 hours apart. And I would always stay in this empty apartment, that was near him, that we knew we had the keys to. We had permission. It was not, it was an empty apartment. I was allowed to spend the night there. Well, long story short, we get there. Again, I live like 2.5, 3 hours away. And we kind of had like this loose like curfew of like when to hang out. And it was time for me to go to bed in this apartment. Well, they switched the key. And we had no idea what to do. And it was that specific weekend, his roommates were out of town. And so what Michael did, he pulled his truck up to his window, put an extension cord with a fan out in his truck. He slept in his truck, and I slept in that apartment. And that to me was like, I know this man will protect that at all costs, even if we get married. So that's just one example of in the dating world that we experience, like of him showing that leadership.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you won't fight for boundaries when you're dating, you're not going to fight for boundaries when you're married.
No.
And so you do have to see those signs that are there. And that is the beauty of the dating phase, is you get to see, can I see myself marrying this person? So you do, to your point, want to look for glimpses of elements that are present in Ephesians 5. I think that also the flip side, there are relationships, and we walk through this, where, and I'm just going to kind of speak candidly, but like the woman in the relationship is unbelievably like domineering, like owns the whole relationship. And it shouldn't work that way either way, but it makes it really challenging, because it's like, man, at the end of the day, like, how is this working out? Is this what marriage is going to look like for you? Is this what, and it's like, you've got to look and evaluate those things. Like, are there potentials there? Like, and I've seen this with issues that come up where the woman is like, heck no. And the man's like, well, I really feel like this is, direction or whatever. And again, they're not called to that, but just even as they look to reconcile, it's like, well, when you do get married, what is this issue going to look like?
Right.
Does she trust you? Is she willing to follow your lead on that and know that you have your best interest at heart? And so again, I love the way you said that, is like, you've got to look for glimpses of Ephesians 5 while at the same time you're not held to the standard of Ephesians 5.
No.
Yeah, that's good. And it goes back to the piece you mentioned, Ashley, of like communication. Like, can you at least have the conversation about
Right.
it? Is it on both the dude and the girl? Like, is the dude just saying, no, this is my decision, and not communicating the why? Is she going, well, no, this is just how it is, and not actually wanting to lay out the reason she thinks it's wise? I think communication is such a big deal, and I think hopefully those are helpful little tidbits for people who are either looking to date or in a dating relationship. But as a married dude, I'm a little selfish. I also want your opinions on some marriage advice of over the years, as you all have mentored married couples or just seen people in different marriages. What are some of the common themes of that? Advice, biblical principles, things you see pop up. What would you say for marriage specifically?
You want me to start, or you?
I can start. This is definitely our wheelhouse. We've sat down with many couples, and then we've lived a lot of married life together. And what do they say?
And made a lot of mistakes.
Yeah,
we've done a lot of things well, but we've also
marry like 3 different people, right? Because you're.
That's not literally, by the way.
No. Like you marry, like Michael is not who he was when we got married, and that's not a bad thing. I mean, if you both are believers, you're being sanctified daily.
Thankfully, he no longer wears those baggy shorts.
Yeah, I know, right? The cargo shorts, yeah. But like, if you're a Christian and you're being sanctified, you're going to be sanctified through trials. You're going to be sanctified through your sin. You're going to be sanctified daily. So of course, I'm not married to the same Michael I was 10 years ago, vice versa. But I think that's a shock to most people. I mean, it's been a shock to us. We've had to relearn each other. We've had to relearn our love languages, what makes us tick, what annoys us. But again, that also goes back to communication. Do you have an open door of communication of saying, hey, I really don't like when you do that? Or, hey, I really like when you do this. This makes me feel really loved. This makes me feel seen. I think so many marriage problems actually do go back to communication. Literally almost every topic goes back to communication. I mean, we would say beyond Jesus, beyond the gospel, obviously is your foundation of marriage. But beyond that, communication literally ties into everything. And so that has been our common theme that we have seen, that we have even experienced ourselves, where we have had to really refine what communication looks like. I mean, even post kids, post trials, even in the way that we mourn. I mean, in the past few years of things with our children, like, we have had to learn how we mourn, that Michael and me, we handle things a little differently. And how can I be there for him? How can he be there for me? So you find out a lot about each other through those different seasons.
That's good.
Yeah, I think I would summarize a couple of things. I was just thinking about categories as you were talking that would be helpful. And I think number one is a right perspective of intimacy. And I say that in a big way. Like, intimacy is more than sex, but it includes sex. And a right perspective on both of those things is really, really important when it comes to marriage. That's been one of the biggest things we've walked through with couples, is just confusion or misunderstanding or frustrations even, know.
Maybe this is a whole nother podcast. It probably is, but what's right? What is a right perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it might be another whole nother podcast. We could talk about this for an hour. But I think understanding it's a marathon, not a sprint, number one, when it comes to the sexual side. But man, what feeds the sexual side is everything else. And I think what people assume is we jump into marriage and we just go 0 to 60 and, here it is. And we're just like mind-blowing moments. And it's like, that's God intended it to be something that you learn together, that you grow in together, and that you build toward together. And so there is so much that happens outside of the bedroom that fosters intimacy that I think couples so often miss. We've missed that in the past. Like, it's intimacy starts, outside of the bedroom, And so I think people understanding that is really big. Intimacy happens through connection. It happens through feeling safe, not just physically safe, but emotionally safe. And all of these things build and foster an environment where sexual intimacy can happen. And when that happens, you're also learning that together and you're experiencing that together. And so there's a whole nother podcast, but I think having the right perspective on that, and even the goal of that, serving one another, there's a whole piece to that. So I think that's category one. Number two, I affirm what she said. Communication is vital. It is essential to a marriage. And the number one issue that we've walked through with lots and lots and lots of couples is a gap in communication. Because communication affects everything. It affects the spiritual side. Like you talk about the spiritual element in your marriage and discipling one another, and it affects that. It affects the intimacy side, communicating within the bedroom and outside of the bedroom, what your needs are, what you don't like, what you do like. It affects leadership and submission and how you do that well and what that looks like. Communication literally impacts and affects everything. And so you've got to be good communicators. And I would say, part of the role of the man as the leader is he needs to lead the way in fostering environments for communication.
That's good.
One of the gaps that I see so often is men are not good at communicating with their spouse. And the same true with women. I think women hold back a lot. Men just sweep it under the rug. Women compartmentalize that junk, and it builds and builds and builds, and it creates isolation and resentment. For men, they just sweep it under the rug, sweep it under the rug, sweep it under the rug. And what ends up happening is they have a marriage where they find themselves like, man, I don't really know what it looks like to lead, or I'm not really leading. And part of your call to lead, right? Like leadership is service, but one of the ways that you serve the relationship is by fostering spaces for communication to happen. How are you? How was your day? What are places I've missed? What are ways I can better serve you? Communication is a massive part of that. And I think the third category is men putting into practice Ephesians 5, which is leading in the home. And that is that leadership happens through service. That leadership happens by bathing your wife with the word, like making sure that she's nourished, making sure that her needs are met, making sure that she feels fulfilled and honored and valued and respected and loved and all of those kind of things. You're not just kind of like, doing life together. You're pursuing her, and your call is to pursue her, and you never stop dating, and you never stop serving. And I think there's a gap in that for a lot of men, that they just kind of get complacent. They're not intentional in conversations. They're not intentional in accountability or, convictions that they have, like spiritually, like our family needs to be involved in the local church. Our family needs to be engaging in ministry together. Here's what it looks like to interact in the church. I just think that's another big gap that we've seen, is men not doing what Ephesians 5 calls them to do.
Yeah, that's really good. What about kind of last pieces? We've covered a lot that are probably just podcasts in and of themselves. So maybe we would love to have you back, Ashley, for more follow-ups. Sure. But on this topic of communication in general, what are, I guess, I asked you what are some questions that people don't often ask, but what are, I guess, some ways in which just practical tips to improve one's communication in marriage?
For sure, yeah.
Whether it's like how you approach those conversations, do you schedule it? Just like very practically.
I mean, just from experience of our marriage, and also just diving into other people that are in our community, I think some couples actually do need to schedule it. I mean, we know several families that they schedule it at the beginning of the week, and they sit down and they talk about finances. They talk about, what's your week look like? How are you feeling? How are you doing here? How are you doing spiritually? What have you read in the Word? I mean, if you're not communicating already, that's probably a really good starting point.
Yeah, that's good.
But also not make it so rigid where it feels a part of your job. And I know that that's kind of a gray area, but like Michael said, like this emotional connection, a lot of times when we get to like systems, that emotional connection can actually dissolve because we're so focused on a system. And
you actually called me in that in our marriage, because I was like, hey, let's have on date night, let's have 5 things we walk through, and you're like, hey, this feels overly systematic for you.
For sure. Yeah. And so like on a date night when we're out in a restaurant, that is not where I want to talk about these different things. Like
you don't want to break down the budget on a date night?
No, I want to be able to not think about the kids or anything serious, financial. I don't want you asking me what I bought yesterday that showed up on Mint. Like, that's not where I want to do it.
I'd come with like 3 major things. Like, hey, I want to talk to you about these 2 things. She's like, how's really not. And I had to learn it's one of the ways I can serve her and love her well, to be like, all right, I'm not going to talk about
Ashley's just trying to get some sushi.
Right?
Yeah, I'm just trying to eat my sushi in peace.
Cheeky.
But I will say they are important. So me and Michael actually don't really struggle in the communication department of like how often we communicate. Where we have had to work on it is how.
Yeah.
Again, seasons change. We have kids. Like, there's certain things we're not going to talk about in front of our kids. So we have to wait till they're in bed. We have to wait till there's a space where no one's at our house and it's just me and him. And then, again, like he said, loving me well. Like, if I'm exhausted from being with the kids all day, it is really hard rewiring to go from thinking about the kids' needs to all of a sudden switching over to what questions he has. So this is a piece of advice that I actually gave last week to a man. If if you need to ask first, almost for permission. Like for example, if Michael needs to talk to me about something and I've had a really long day and he's like, hey, I would really like to talk to you about XYZ. Are you up for that tonight? I have the freedom to say, hey, I need to, as the woman, I need to make sure I show him respect and word it correctly. But hey, I'm not trying to duck your question. I'm not trying to avoid this topic. I want you to know that. But I just don't think you're not going to get the best of me tonight. I'm really exhausted. Can we plan that? So sometimes it's going to be planned.
That's good.
There are other moments where we're sitting on the couch and it's before we watch a show and we get into a deep conversation and we actually end up not watching a show because we just talk for 2 or 3 hours about, and it was not planned.
Yep.
So I think it looks many ways.
Yeah.
Well, and some of it too, I mean, like, you know, at the end of the day, like, Ashley's my best friend. And, you know, part of what makes her my best friend is she's the one I go to and I can open up to and I can share anything with. And so we have a rhythm that's organic of every night we're doing a touch base.
But not everyone's like that. And I will say this is kind of my last piece of advice that we've learned actually through marriage counseling. If you have not done marriage counseling, highly recommend it.
We have done it.
It's like going to the dentist. It's for maintenance. It's not necessarily, don't wait till you have a cavity.
Yeah.
Right,
don't wait till you need to go.
That's the case for any therapy.
100% for sure. So we're really big advocates for that. But one of the biggest pieces of advice for us, and this has to do with communication and that intimacy emotionally, assume the best of your spouse. That's not always easy, especially when you've been married a long time and you know them, you know their deepest struggles, you know their sins, you want to assume the worst. Assume the best. And one of the best lines our counselor gave us for example, if I'm coming to Michael about something that I think he did wrong against me, and it's not really that black and white, it's something I'm kind of assuming, we use the phrase, the story I'm telling myself. Hey, the story I'm telling myself is that you
that's really good.
XYZ. Because that way you start the conversation on the right foot, not the assumption that
not accusatory.
He did this purposely to maliciously hurt me.
The other thing is, and you know, when you're talking, and you know, we tend to be kind of loud talkers anyway. We're like really intense people, passionate people. You may see this on the. I don't know if it comes through on the camera, but like, you know, one of the other things you can say that we learned in counseling, well, it was really helpful, is, hey, the way I'm experiencing you right now is this. You seem angry. Oh gosh, I'm not angry at all. Like, I'm not. Oh, okay. Like, hey, well, your tone was, you know, the way I'm receiving this or the way I'm experiencing you. But I think having that open line of communication and just a natural rhythm of, you know, check-ins. And again, this is where I put the onus on the man. Are you asking your wife how her day was? Are you asking her, you know, hey, is there anything that you need to talk about or feel like you want to talk to me about tonight? It doesn't have to be like this rigid moment. So for some people, it needs to be. For some people, it can just be very natural. Like, you know, I think sometimes we overcomplicate things or can. But you have to start somewhere. And so if a meeting is helpful, do a meeting. That's great. Mm-hmm. You know, if a structure to walk through is helpful, then do the structure and walk through it. The big thing is the end game goal, which is that you feel connected to your wife and your wife feels connected to you. That's what communication fosters, is connection. And here's what connection fosters: intimacy. Yeah. And so, this is how this all fits together. And so it's why when there's a gap in communication, there's a gap in intimacy, there's a gap in connection. There's just everything. Spiritually, there's gaps. And I think, and I'll say this to the men out there, I recognize there's probably people listening to this podcast and you feel like, hey, we do not communicate well. And some of you may be hearing this and you feel like we are way behind the 8 ball in this thing. We've been married for 4 or 5 years and I don't communicate anything to my wife. Now, I will say this caveat. I had to work on not over communicating. I would just like vomit, you know, and like, because I was so intent on like, I want you to know everything I'm feeling. She's like, I didn't necessarily need to know that, you know, like, so again, communication, but we had to work in scale. So we didn't have this figured out, and we're still working on it. But I had to work on and still have to work on, you know, being reserved. For a lot of men, it's the opposite of like you don't communicate at all. And there's a lot of stuff your wife does that bothers you, or there's things spiritually that you want to see her grow in that you've not talked to her about, or there's, you know, accountability, whatever it is. And so what I would say to them is start somewhere. Start small and start somewhere, but do it in a way that's loving, caring, and nurturing, and honoring to your wife and respectful of your wife as your co-laborer, right? Like as your teammate, as your best friend. You're approaching this to say, and maybe even owning, hey, listen, babe, I want you to know I haven't done the best job in kind of being open and honest with you in life and things that I want to talk with you about. And I would love, if you're open to this, to figure out a way that we can work on our communication, because there's things I want to share with you, and I want to make sure there's things that or I'm open to things that you want to share with me. Some of y'all are going to have to rip the Band-Aid off and kind of have that conversation to reset, because we've also seen like people realize, oh, we're not good at communication, but they take no steps forward, and then they come back and sit with us a month later, and it's like, well, you're still not talking about these things.
Yeah, and it's going to be awkward. If you're not regularly communicating, it's going to be very awkward at first, and I think to expect that. It's going to be awkward. And you know, if you don't feel like your spouse is your best friend, I know we don't always feel that way. Obviously marriage
you don't
is
feel
not
like that all the time?
Not all the time.
Oh.
but we have
communicate about that later.
but we have a baseline, like we fully trust each other. I would say, you know, I know not everybody has this story where we can sit on the couch for 3 hours and talk about like everything. I know that's not always common. So I do want to say to the people out there that are struggling in their marriage that they don't communicate at all. You know, a starting place is better than nothing. Like, you cannot go to 0 to 100. Like, you have to start somewhere. Like Michael said, the man should be the leader, but in some cases they're not. And so as a woman, if you're in a marriage where you feel like, my husband, he definitely won't do that, then you need to initiate. I think you do need to initiate it. Be like, hey, husband, like it would really mean a lot to me if we start talking about XYZ. And the end of that, like, it's not too late to go to marriage counseling. Like, I actually am doing life with some people right now that they are ready to exit their marriage. And it is really, really sad to see. And one of the common themes is they literally don't communicate. They don't, right. and they don't even communicate that they want marriage counseling. Marriage counseling, again, I just want to say this for the record. Marriage counseling is amazing. It is not bad. It
forces you to communicate. It jumpstarts that.
It actually is a mediator to help you communicate better, because we both have different pasts. We have different history. We have different parents. We were raised differently, so we have to communicate to meet each other's needs. Yeah. So again, to start somewhere, and at the end of the day, marriage counseling is not the last resort. It should be one of the first.
That's good.
And secondly, to be in community.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And discuss all this in community. Yeah, because your spouse cannot be your everything, and they cannot meet all your needs.
They're not Jesus, right?
Yeah.
That's good.
One last thing I'd say to wrap it up, just kind of the summary of what we've talked about, is when it comes to communication too, nothing should be off limits. And I mean that. Nothing in your marriage should be off limits. There should be nothing that you say, in essence, I can't talk to my wife about this. I'm not talking about something somebody told you to pray for that's personal.
Yeah, that's different.
I'm talking about things going on in you.
That's good.
Within each other. Yeah.
Within each other. And that sexual intimacy, that's how you feel about sexual intimacy. That's how you feel about things that bother you or encourage you, right? Like, nothing should be off limits on that. Parenting, how you parent, what your thoughts are on how the other person parented, right? Like, none of that at all should be off limits. And then, I would say the other piece is, like you said, you've got to start somewhere, and know this, none of us have this figured out. Marriage is hard. Marriage is work. Mm-hmm. And the marriages that last are marriages that people have fought for. Mm-hmm. And what you got to realize is marriage is not something that's designed to make you happy. It's something that's designed to make you holy. And so marriage is a tool that God uses to help sanctify you. And I think having the right perspective of that marriage is not all warm bubblies and fuzzies and, just making out all the time and having sex all the time and doing all these things. Like, that's not how God designed it. Like, God designed it to be partners together, to mirror the gospel to one another and reflect the gospel to the world. And so know that marriage is work. Nobody has it figured out. And the only way to move forward is to continue to evaluate, communicate, and make the gospel the center of your relationship.
Yeah, that's really good. And thanks, y'all, for being willing to have a little longer podcast talking about a pretty intense topic. And if you have follow-up questions, please feel free to email those to us at pastormike@imageatl.com. And we hope that this has been helpful for you, whether you're single, looking to date, currently dating, or married, and that you take a next step towards communicating better and mirroring Christ in your marriage more. And like I said, if you have questions, feel free to email those to us. Share this with a friend if you think it was helpful. And with that being said, we hope you continue to live beyond Sunday.